Al-Jazeera Storm, the beginning of the end. Date 9th of September 2017. As the campaign of the Euphrates rage and its battles continued and is about to end, and loomed on the horizon the end of the battle to liberate the entire city of Raqqa from ISIS terrorists. After the liberation of about 70% of the city, the Syrian Democratic Forces announced in a statement a new campaign under the name of Al-Jazeera Storm to expel the terrorist organization from the east of the province of Deir ez-Zor and to liberate the rest of the territory of the Syrian Jazeera and the eastern Euphrates River and the eastern countryside of Deir ez-Zor of terrorism. The head of Deir ez-Zor Military Council in the Syrian Democratic Forces, Ahmad Abu Khawla, reads the statement of the beginning of the campaign at a press conference in the village of Abu Fas in rural Deir ez-Zor, and is attended by many media outlets. The campaign began at an unusually high pace and made rapid progress toward Deir ez-Zor, where fighters showed high combat efficiency and speed in maneuvering and stunning, leading ISIS to lose the ability to confront. In the first days of the campaign, it achieved tangible progress by liberating the village of Al-Arbidi on the main road on Abu Fas axis in Deir ez-Zor, as well as controlling Al-Hajif.
طبعا حملة عاصفة الجزيرة انطلقت بوتيرة عالية غير معهودة، حققت تقدما سريعا باتجاه دير ez-Zor، حيث أبدى مقاتلين في الجبهات كفاءة قتالية عالية وسرعة في المناورة والمباغتة. أفشلت التنظيم الإرهابي داعش وأذهلته في القدرة على التصدي لهم، حيث حققت الحملة في أيامها الأولى تقدما ملموسا وسريعا، حيث حررت القرى في دير ez-Zor كقرية العريبدي، وأيضا حررت مرتفعات استراتيجية في جنوب قرية الحجيب، وأيضا تم تحرير القرى المالحة وآبار البترول المحيطة بها.
In the south of the village and liberating Al-Maliha village and the nearby oil wells. In the second day of the campaign, the first factions of the Deir ez-Zor Military Council were able to surprise the terrorist organization holed up in the industrial city of Deir ez-Zor. It reached its first streets and clashed with the terrorist organization. Heavy fighting broke out in the city. Syrian Democratic Forces advanced through the use of booby traps and suicide attacks. On September 11th, 2017, a group of sheikhs, tribal dignitaries and social, political and cultural activists launched a preparatory committee to discuss the principles of establishing Deir ez-Zor Civil Council to reach a formula which reflects the aspirations of the people of the city, like the civil councils of different cities liberated from the grip of terrorism, and is concerned with the administration of the city immediately after liberation. Accordingly, the preparatory committee issued its support for the Al-Jazeera Storm campaign and called on all the young people of Deir ez-Zor to join the Syrian Democratic Forces. 13th September 2017. Syrian Democratic Forces managed to liberate the cotton mills, the largest industrial facility in the province of Deir ez-Zor, after heavy fighting with the terrorists. In this way, Syrian Democratic Forces managed to cut the road between Deir ez-Zor, Al-Hasaka and As-Sur and took control of it completely. The forces made progress in the axis of Abu Khashab towards the axis of sugar factory to free it from the terrorists.
تمكن مقاتلي قوات سوريا الديمقراطية بعد المعارك التي خاضتها مع مرتزقة داعش. طبعا هذه المعارك كانت عنيفة جدا، وصلت إلى أعلى مستوياتها، وبذلك استطاعت قواتنا بقطع الطريق الواصل بين دير الزور والحسكة والصور، وحررته بشكل كامل من أيدي المرتزقة، وأيضا حققت تقدم في محور أبو خشب، طبعا باتجاه محور معمل السكر لتحريره من الإرهابيين.
Simultaneously, the Syrian Democratic Forces announced that by completing the liberation of the industrial city, the road would be open to reach the banks of the Euphrates River in Deir ez-Zor. On September 17th, after the liberation of the industrial city, Syrian Democratic Forces managed to liberate the 7 square kilometer textile, sugar and spinning factories, as well as the electricity company, and to reach the strategic 7 kilometers roundabout, which is considered a point of contact between As-Salahiyya and Al-Mayadin city. 8 days after the start of the campaign, Syrian Democratic Forces continued to march toward the terrorist organization strongholds, in spite of the air raids carried about by the Russian warplanes against them to block the progress, but didn't limit the pace operations. And it advanced 63 kilometers deep in the terrorist control areas, and was able to free 14 farms and villages and 2 large towns, as well as the liberation of the sugar factory, the electricity company, then 15 face-to-face confrontation with terrorists recorded. Some 4,000 civilians have been evacuated to safe areas, despite repeated attempts to block their progress through suicide attacks and car bombs. During these battles, the bodies of many terrorists were caught in the hands of Syrian Democratic Forces. 20th September 2017. East of the industrial city, north of Deir ez-Zor, witnessed a remarkable progress of 5 kilometers of Syrian Democratic Forces, and they managed to liberate 15 farms. In contrast, on the west bank of the Euphrates River, while clashes continued between the forces of the Syrian regime and its ally Russia and terrorists of ISIS, the flow of hundreds of civilians fleeing to the areas controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces, searching for a safe haven. Even in the evening hours, Syrian Democratic Forces continued their advance in Abu Fas axis, east of the industrial zone of Deir ez-Zor, and managed to liberate 10 other farms, along with the evacuation of dozens of families.
في 20 من أيلول 2017 تقدما ملحوظا مقاتلي قوات سوريا الديمقراطية، حيث حرروا 5 كيلومتر مربع وتمكنوا من تحرير 15 مزرعة. بالمقابل، وعلى الضفة الغربية لنهر الفرات، وفيما كانت الاشتباكات في أعلى مستوياتها ومتواصلة بين قواتنا وقوات النظام السوري وحليفتها روسيا والتنظيم الإرهابي داعش، حيث تدفق مئات من المدنيين الفارين منها صوب مناطق المحررة من قبل قوات سوريا الديمقراطية بحثا عن الملاذ الآمن. وحتى ساعات المساء واصلت قوات سوريا الديمقراطية تقدمها في محور أبو فاس شرقي المنطقة الصناعية في دير الزور، حيث أيضا استطاعت تحرير 10 مزارع أخرى إلى جانب إجلاء عشرات العائلات.
On September 21st, Syrian Democratic Forces advanced in Abu Fas axis and As-Sur area on the border between Syria and Iraq, and liberated 1,000 civilians from various villages east of the Euphrates River, mostly women, children, and elderly. moved then to Camp Assad, which was created specifically for Deir ez-Zor deserters. On September 22nd, the battles with all its ferocity reached Al-Konico and Al-Izba factories in Assur area, northeast of Deir ez-Zor. Meantime, a sandstorm, which the terrorist organization tried to exploit it and carried out an attack against the positions of Syrian Democratic Forces, blew up and thwarted the attack, and the Syrian Democratic Forces captured one of the terrorists and seized his armored vehicle. The violent clashes lasted for long hours in the vicinity of the two companies, during which Syrian Democratic Forces surrounded the terrorists inside the two companies, considered one of the largest gas companies in Syria. The surprise and the great shock of the terrorist organization was on the morning of 22nd of September 2017, when the Deir ez-Zor Military Council took control of Al-Izba oil station and Konico Oil Company after 2 days siege.
بعد حصار دام ليومين على مرتزقة داعش، استطاع مقاتلين التقدم عليهم في 23 من أيلول 2017 وتحرير منه محطة العزبة النفطية وشركة الكونيكو أيضا. طبعا هذه كانت صدمة لمرتزقة داعش، حيث أن هاتين الشركتين تعتبران من أكبر شركات الغاز في سوريا.
The military victories on the fronts were crowned with a political victory of equal importance. On 25th September, the Deir ez-Zor Civil Council was established after a preparatory committee was set up for consultations and a final version of the council, which includes all sectors and components of the city. Immediately, the board established its 14 committees as follows: Women's Committee, Justice Committee, Reconciliation Committee, Youth and Sports Committee, Organizations and Humanitarian Affairs Committee, Services and Municipalities Committee, Education Committee, Antiques and Culture Committee, Agriculture and Livestock Committee, Finance Committee, Security Committee, Protection Committee, Martyrs Families Committee, Council Organization Committee. However, it seems that the victories achieved by the Syrian Democratic Forces to defeat terrorism didn't match the interests and orientations of other forces that continue to invest in terrorism and in the organization of ISIS. After the liberation of Konico gas field north of Deir ez-Zor, Russia, on the 25th of September, launched a second attack on it in a few days, where the field was targeted by raids, causing losses among the Syrian Democratic Forces and resulted of one martyr of the fighters and wounding two others, in addition to causing material damage to the infrastructure of the field.
بعد تحرير حقل الكونيكو وخسارة داعش الفادحة وتقدم مقاتلين على الأرض، نفذ الطيران الروسي في 25 من أيلول 2017 اعتداء على قواتنا بغارات جوية استهدف فيها حقل الكونيكو، وتسبب في خسائر في صفوف قواتنا، حيث أدى إلى استشهاد أحد مقاتلينا وجرح 2، وبالإضافة إلى ذلك قد أدى إلى إلحاق خسائر مادية بالبنى التحتية للحقل.
As the campaign entered its 17th day on 26th September, the entrance to the town of Assur, located to the northeast of Deir ez-Zor, witnessed violent clashes, and the Syrian Democratic Forces liberated the silos and reached the western entrance of the town. In an effort to prevent the advance of Syrian Democratic Forces, ISIS terrorists attacked the fighters' points with a booby-trapped vehicle, but was destroyed before reaching its target. The next day, the clashes continued inside Assur town, and Syrian Democratic Forces managed to liberate half of the town. The clash resulted in killing of 5 terrorists whose bodies were captured by Syrian Democratic Forces and the seizure of a number of weapons and military equipment. After a day of clashes and fierce fighting between the two sides on the 19th day of the campaign, Syrian Democratic Forces managed to kill 2 terrorists carrying explosive builds before reaching their targets and liberating the entire strategic Assur town and the villages of Assad and Bir al-Nafakh. Following the liberation of the town of Assur, the campaign entered a new phase and began to move on 4 axes, aiming to liberate the entire Syrian Jazeera from terrorism.
وبعد يوم من الاشتباكات والمعارك العنيفة بين مقاتلين ومرتزقة داعش، تمكن مقاتلين وفي اليوم 19 للحملة من قتل إرهابيين يحملون أحزمة ناسفة طبعا قبل وصولهم إلى هدفهم. وبعد تحرير الكامل لبلدة الصور الاستراتيجية وقريتي السعد وبير النفاخ، طبعا أثر تحرير بلدة الصور دخلت الحملة في مرحلة جديدة، حيث بدأ التحرك على 4 محاور مستهدفة تحرير كامل الجزيرة السورية من الإرهابيين.
In the first axis, the movement started from the village of Al-Jazeera, and the field of progress was about 20 kilometers. On the second axis, the entire industrial city in Al-Jazeera was cleaned of mines and booby traps planted by ISIS. On the third axis, the village of Assad and the town of Assur were completely cleared. The engineering teams cleaned the town of mines and bombs. The fourth axis started from the village of Shayyad and Al-Anad toward the town of Markada. The forces liberated about 25 kilometers in the axis. On 13th September, the official spokeswoman for Al-Jazeera Storm campaign in Deir ez-Zor, Lilwal Abdallah, confirmed that the Syrian Democratic Forces had liberated the Jafra oil fields northeast of Deir ez-Zor, where the terrorist organization of ISIS depend on the fields Jafra to secure funding for terrorism and used as a starting point to carry out attacks against the position and concentrations of Syrian Democratic Forces. By liberating it, the terrorist organization has lost its most important source of funding and one of its strategic strongholds.
حررت قواتنا حقل الجفرة النفطي طبعا بعد ساعات متواصلة من الاشتباكات لتحرير هذا الحقل. طبعا هذا الحقل كان هو مصدر تمويل للإرهابيين، طبعا كما استخدموه أيضا كنقطة انطلاق لتنفيذ هجماته ضد تمركز قواتنا. طبعا وبتحريره قد يكون التنظيم الإرهابي فقد أهم مصادر تمويل وأيضا أهم معاقل الاستراتيجية التي كان ينفذ هجماته على نقاط قواتنا.
As Al-Jazeera Storm campaign entered its 25th day, Syrian Democratic Forces managed to advance in Al-Jazeera axis and liberate the villages of Greater Harmushia, Little Harmushia, Tal Kisra, and Tal Abu Fahd, after heavy clashes where 20 terrorists were killed. On October 5th, terrorists launched a car bomb attack on the village of Juwaif in Markada, but the Syrian Democratic Forces foiled the attack and destroyed the booby trap while the fighters continued to advance in Assur axis near the Syrian-Iraqi border. The campaign continued to progress steadily on the ground and gave civilians great importance, by serving their lives and saving them from the clutches of the terrorist organization. On 7th October, Syrian Democratic Forces were able to evacuate and liberate 20,000 civilians from the areas of clashes, liberate Washia village near the town of Assur, and extend 3 kilometers in Markada axis. During 3 days, the forces of the Axis Al-Jazeera met with the forces of the Axis Abu Khashab after the liberation of some villages.
واصلت حملتنا عملياتها العسكرية على الأرض. طبعا أعطت المدنيين الأهمية الكبرى، وذلك بالحفاظ على حياتهم وإنقاذهم من التنظيم الإرهابي داعش الذي طال لسنوات متواصلة. وفي 7 من تشرين الأول استطاع مقاتلين إجلاء وتحرير 20,000 مدني من مناطق الاشتباكات إلى المناطق التي حررتها قواتنا. طبعا وأيضا حررت قرية الوسيعة. هذه القرية قريبة من بلدة الصور، وكما تقدموا 3 كيلومتر من محور مرقدة. طبعا وخلال أيام 3 التقت قواتنا في محور الجزرات مع محور أبو خشب بعد تحرير بعض من القرى.
In the axis of Al-Jazeera, the troops arrived at the outskirts of the village of Muelih in the northwest of Assur. During the clashes that took place in the axis, 3 terrorists were killed. The following day, the Syrian Democratic Forces freed 10,000 civilians who had fled their homes because of terrorist practices and the bombing of Russian and Syrian planes. Al-Jazeera Storm liberates wheat silos. The campaign continued its advance in all directions, where it advanced more than 5 kilometers amid clashes and fierce battles with ISIS terrorists. In the axis of Abu Fas, 4 kilometers south of Al-Jafra oil fields, and strong clashes near the train station took place. In the axis of Assur town, the village of Muelih was liberated after a large sweep of the area. While advancing in the axis of Abu Khashab, 1.5 kilometers south of the sugar company, and managed to free grain silos and seized 5 Hummer vehicles, a tank and 2 military vehicles and a car bomb and a number of missiles. The terrorists tried to disrupt the advance of the fighters using a car bomb, but was detonated before reaching its goal. As a result of the inability of the terrorist organization to confront the Syrian Democratic Forces, on 12th October, the terrorists targeted a large convoy of displaced people from Deir ez-Zor, fleeing the control areas of the Syrian regime on the western side of the Euphrates River, as well as from the areas of ISIS control to areas controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces, by a car bomb that killed and wounded dozens of civilians.
بعد خسارة داعش الفادحة في المنطقة صب جام غضبه ووحشيته على المدنيين النازحين، فاستهدف في 5 من تشرين الثاني رتلا للنازحين الهاربين من المناطق المسيطرة عليها إلى المناطق التي حررتها قواتنا. طبعا حدث هذا الاستهداف بعربة مفخخة انفجرت بين المدنيين في المنطقة الواقعة بين شركة كونيكو وبين حقول الجفرة، حيث أدت إلى مقتل أكثر من 100 مدني حاولوا الوصول إلى المناطق الآمنة التي حررتها قواتنا.
After 2 days of fighting and violent clashes, axes of Assur and Markada also met. In an attempt to turn the scales of the battle in his favor, the terrorist organization continued its attacks. On October 19th, it launched an attack on Al-Abu Khashab front, but Syrian Democratic Forces fighters foiled it and inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. They seized 9 vehicles, including 5 car bombs, 6 motorbikes, mortars, RPG launchers, large quantities of ammunition. The liberation of the village of Sheikh Hamad, northwest of Assur town, and found in the village of Bawadi al-Jasmi a 120 millimeters mortar and a factory for manufacturing mines and explosives. On 22nd October, Syrian Democratic Forces carried out a surprise military operation targeting the terrorist strongholds in Al-Umar oil field, the largest oil fields in Syria, and liberate the field as a result of the operation. The 24th of October 2017, Syrian Democratic Forces foiled synchronous attacks by ISIS and the Syrian regime forces in Al-Jabeila village, southwestern Deir ez-Zor, and the train station in center of Al-Jafra. 9 terrorists were killed during the clashes, in addition to another attack on the village of Al-Harriya and the seizure of an armored vehicle and a military vehicle for terrorists. On 26th October 2017, the village of Al-Rabida was liberated, the birthplace of the commander of Deir ez-Zor Military Council, Ahmad Abu Khawla, 44 kilometers northeast of Deir ez-Zor. Until the end of October 2017, dozens of villages were liberated southeast of Deir ez-Zor. Due to the heavy losses suffered by the terrorist organization, it aimed to pour its brutality on the displaced civilians. On November 5th, a convoy of displaced people fleeing their areas of control was targeted while heading to the areas liberated by the Syrian Democratic Forces. A car bomb exploded among the civilians in the area between Conoco gas, oil, and oil fields of Al-Jafra, which led to the death of more than 100 civilians who were trying to reach the safe areas controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces. The following day, during the sweep of the internal security forces in the village of Muhammada, a minefield was found belonging to the terrorist organization, which contained quantities of mines and explosives. 9th November 2017, Syrian Democratic Forces liberated the town of Markada, in addition to 24 villages after a siege lasted several days. The terrorist organization attempted to restore the initiative, launching an attack on the oil fields, but was foiled and the 3 terrorists were killed. The following day, Syrian Democratic Forces liberated the residential town of the Al-Umar oil field from ISIS after fierce fighting, in which 15 terrorists were killed and some of the heavy weapons and ammunition left behind by the terrorists were taken away. On 12th November, the town of Al-Busayra was liberated in the eastern countryside of Deir ez-Zor and continued its march toward the village of Shohail. A new battle was launched on the 13th November to liberate Al-Tanak field, 35 kilometers east of Deir ez-Zor, and the oil company. The field witnesses fierce clashes and battles in which the fighters managed to liberate the field from the terrorists and kill 19 of them. On the same day, they liberated the village of Ash-Shohail al-Gharbi, 40 kilometers southeast of Deir ez-Zor from ISIS after violent clashes. The terrorist organization launched a counterattack on Al-Tanak oil field and in the village of Ash-Shuhail, but was thwarted. The attack was resumed the next day, and it was also thwarted, and 14 terrorists were killed. In an attempt to regain control of Al-Tanak field, terrorists launched another attack on 17th November 2017. And strong clashes broke out southeast of Al-Tanak oil field near the Iraqi border, where terrorists used all types of heavy weapons. Attempts to attack with car bombs on the concentration points of Syrian Democratic Forces, but this attack also was failed too.
طبعا بسبب اعتماد التنظيم الإرهابي داعش على الحقول النفطية لتمويل إرهابه، شن هجوم معاكس على حقل التنك وقرية الشحيل، حيث تم إحباط هذا الهجوم، وعاودوا مرة أخرى في اليوم التالي أيضا لشن هجوم معاكس، وأيضا تم إحباطه وقتل فيه 14 إرهابي.
On the 70th day of the campaign, the village of Dhiban, 50 kilometers northeast of Deir ez-Zor, was liberated and a car bomb was exploded. In the midst of the fierce force and the strong rush of the fighters, they cut off with 3 days 14 kilometers from Al-Tanak oil field and reached the outskirts of the city of Abu Kamal on the Iraqi border amid violent clashes and the killing of a large number of terrorists. On the 1st and the 2nd of December, the villages of Abu Hammam, Al-Hayyan, and Sweden, northeast of Deir ez-Zor, witnessed strong clashes. The two villages were liberated and 72 terrorists were killed, in addition to the destruction of a vehicle loaded with Doshka weapon and the seizure of quantities of weapons and ammunition and capturing 5 terrorists in these battles, while 5 Syrian Democratic Forces fighters were martyred. Another important station in the campaign was December 10th, when the meeting between Syrian Democratic Forces and the military officials in the Iraqi army. The two sides agreed to form a joint coordination center to protect border security. The meeting was attended by the Iraqi Army General Commander of the Iraqi Forces Qasim Muhammad Saleh and his assistant General Abdul Hussein, and by the Syrian Democratic Forces attended by the members of General Command of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign forces Hassan Kamishlo and Angizak Khalil.
شهدت حملة عاصفة الجزيرة الكثير من التقلبات السياسية، حيث أن في 10 من كانون الأول عقد اجتماع بيننا وبين الجانب العسكري من الجيش العراقي، حيث اتفقنا نحن والجيش العراقي على تشكيل غرف عمليات مشتركة للتنسيق بيننا وبينهم بهدف حماية من الحدود.
On December 12th, after fierce clashes between Syrian Democratic Forces and ISIS terrorists, Syrian Democratic Forces managed to liberate the town of Sweden in the eastern countryside of Deir ez-Zor after battles lasted for 12 days, killing 273 terrorists. The bodies of 57 of them fell into the hands of the fighters and seized quantities of weapons and military equipment. On December 16th, fierce fighting broke out between Syrian Democratic Forces members and members of the terrorist organization in the village of Jaras Sharqi. Syrian Democratic Forces liberated the village after killing 42 terrorists, while a fighter of Syrian Democratic Forces martyred. On 20th December, a thunderstorm hit the area and the terrorist organization tried to exploit it. It carried out counterattacks on the points of concentrations of Syrian Democratic Forces in the village of Hammam and Jaras Sharqi. Heavy fighting broke out in the vicinity of the villages. A number of terrorists were killed while the rest fled, and 3 of the Syrian Democratic Forces were martyred. The day after the attacks of the terrorist organization, the Syrian regime and its militias launched heavy weapon attacks on the positions of Syrian Democratic Forces in the village of Al-Basira in the suburb of Deir ez-Zor. The Syrian Democratic Forces responded similarly, and the attacks failed. On December 25th, the Syrian Democratic Forces managed to liberate Mrat's oil field and to liberate the towns of Al-Hasayat and Abu Hardoub from the grip of ISIS. The Syrian Democratic Forces continued its march and liberate many areas and towns. On 27th December, they reached near the town of Al-Mayadin, where the village of Seneda, 30 kilometers northeast of Mayadin, was liberated after fierce clashes and battles, and 30 terrorists were killed. On the 110th day of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign, Syrian Democratic Forces reached the outskirts of Hajin town in the eastern countryside of Deir ez-Zor, about 25 kilometers north of Abu Kamal city. On December 31st, the campaign liberated the village of Subaiha, 20 kilometers north of Hajin. After violent clashes in which 15 terrorists were killed, a car bomb and 2 military vehicles were destroyed.
بعد اشتباكات عنيفة بيننا وبين مرتزقة داعش قتل 15 إرهابي، وأيضا تم تدمير عربة مفخخة لهم وعربتين عسكريتين. طبعا توجت حملة عاصفة الجزيرة آخر يوم من عام 2017 بتحرير قرية الصبحية التي تبعد 20 كيلومتر مربع شمالي هجين.
The Syrian Democratic Forces have issued their military operations as a part of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign since it began on 9th September 2017 until the end of the year. It declared that it liberated the entire northern countryside of Deir ez-Zor, in addition to liberating 9,000 kilometers of the Syrian Jazeera, 290 residential communities between a village and a farm and a town, killing 1,345 terrorists. The bodies of 179 of them were in the hands of the Syrian Democratic Forces, then were buried. More than 4,000 terrorists were wounded and 64 terrorists were captured. 350,000 civilians were rescued and evacuated from the areas of engagement that the terrorist organization took them as human shields. During the operations, 14 Doshka weapons of various caliber were destroyed, 27 trucks with 4 Doshka vehicles, 14 mortars, 24 car bombs, and 18 motorbikes, as well as a large quantities of weapons, ammunition, and other military vehicles. 12 Doshka weapons of various calibers, 12 mortars, 6 PKCs, 9 RPG launchers, 7 different launchers, 1 RPK weapon, 5 Hummer vehicles, 3 Burner sniper rifles, 2 Drakonov sniper rifles, 6 explosive belts, 13 military 4-wheel drive vehicles, 1 Obis gun, 5 car bombs, 1 tank, and other quantities of weapons and military equipment. while 162 Syrian Democratic Forces were martyred and 460 fighters were wounded. At the beginning of the new year, the Syrian Democratic Forces advanced towards Al-Hardoub and Hawi al-Nabi village, 25 kilometers south of Al-Mayadeen city and 25 kilometers north of Al-Hajin town. The villages were liberated after heavy battles. On January 3, 2018, Syrian Democratic Forces expelled the terrorist organization and liberated 3 new villages: Al-Muhammadiyah, Al-Jazeera, and Al-Majid, northeast Al-Mayadeen city.
مع بداية العام الجديد تمكنت قواتنا من التقدم على التنظيم الإرهابي داعش وتحرير العديد من القرى ومنها قرية أبو حردوب وحاوي. طبعا هذه القرى تحررت بعد اشتباكات عنيفة في أعلى وتيرة لها، وأيضا تم تحرير قرية المحيميدة وأرض الزير، ومع تقدم المقاتلين وتصويب ضربات موجعة لمرتزقة داعش تم تحرير بلدة البحرة التي تقع شرقي الميادين.
On 7th January 2018, terrorists who attacked the positions of Syrian Democratic Forces in the village of Al-Bahra, 44 kilometers southeast of Al-Mayadeen, received painful blows. Although the terrorists used in this attack flying aircraft and heavy weapons, but the fighters managed to drop 3 aircrafts and destruct 3 mortars. During the period of approximately 2 weeks, the clashes continued intermittently on all fronts and axes. The Syrian Democratic Forces were busy cleaning the areas liberated from mines and booby traps planted by the terrorist organization, as well as fortifying their defensive positions. The campaign resumed its operations by storming the town of Al-Shufa on January 21, 2018. Violent clashes broke out between Syrian Democratic Forces and ISIS terrorists in the town and its environs. During the clashes, which received heavy coverage from the International Air Force, dozens of terrorists were killed. Some of them were leaders. The forces continued to march toward the town of Al-Bahra, and the clashes broke out with the terrorist organization that lasted more than 20 days in the vicinity. On February 21st, Syrian Democratic Forces broke into the town, which was one of the most important strongholds of the terrorist organization, the main storehouse of its weapons depots, and launch point counterattacks against the positions of Syrian Democratic Forces and civilians.
استأنفت الحملة عملياتها باقتحام بلدة الإشعافة على أثر اشتباكات عنيفة بين مقاتلين وإرهابي داعش، طبعا بتغطية من التحالف الدولي، حيث سقط العشرات القتلى بين صفوف المرتزقة. طبعا وواصلت قواتنا زحفها نحو بلدة البحرة. طبعا بعد الاشتباكات تم تحرير هذه البلدة التي هي تعد من أهم معاقل التنظيم الإرهابي داعش، وكانت المخزن الرئيسي لمستودعات أسلحته، كما كانت نقطة لانطلاق عملياته المضادة ضد مواقع تمركز قواتنا والمدنيين.
At the same time, the field command of the Liberation Battle confirmed that 1,776 terrorists had been killed in more than 20 days of continuous fighting. 16 mortars, 17 car bombs, 8 Doshka weapons, 14 four-wheel drive vehicles loaded with Doshka weapons, 24 bulldozers, 3 car bomb factories, 2 armored vehicles, 5 reconnaissance planes, 7 motorbikes, 12 military vehicles, an OPS gun, 2 BMB vehicles, 3 ammunition transport vehicle, a rocket launcher and a SPG-9 gun. The fighting lasted more than 2 months. The Syrian Democratic Forces engaged in building its fortifications and combing the liberated areas of mines, booby traps, and sleeping cells planted by the terrorist organization. The campaign resumed operation on 13th May 2018 and reached the outskirts of the village of Al-Baghouz. It advanced approximately 21 kilometers along the Syrian-Iraqi border after the Iraqi army completed the liberation of the Iraqi village of Al-Baghouz, weeks earlier east of the Euphrates River. 3rd of June 2018. On this day, the official announcement of the second phase of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign was announced.
بيان إلى الرأي العام في إطار المرحلة الثانية من حملة عاصفة الجزيرة، وبعد أن استكملت قواتنا تحرير الباغوز وإحكام الحصار على المناطق التي يتمركز فيها التنظيم الإرهابي داعش، فإن قواتنا الآن تعلن بدء العمليات العسكرية لتحرير بلدة الدشيشة.
After Syrian Democratic Forces complete its preparations and after the completion of the liberation of the village of Al-Baghouz, Syrian Democratic Forces began a large-scale military operation in coordination with the Iraqi army and the direct support with the international coalition forces from Al-Shaddadi and Al-Hol axes in Al-Hasaka countryside, and the completion of the securing the Syrian-Iraqi border and for the complete cleansing of the province of Al-Hasaka from the existence of the terrorist organization.
بعد تحرير قرية الباغوز قد بدأت قواتنا عملية عسكرية واسعة وجديدة بالتنسيق مع الجيش العراقي ودعم من التحالف الدولي. طبعا هذه العملية كانت بمحورين، المحور الأول الشدادي والمحور الثاني محور الهول. طبعا أهداف هذه الحملة هو تحرير بلدة الدشيشة التي تعتبر من أهم معاقل تنظيم داعش الإرهابي في ريف الحسكة. طبعا هذه الحملة هي لاستكمال تأمين حدود السورية العراقية وتطهير كامل ريف محافظة الحسكة من وجود التنظيم الإرهابي.
The operation continued with all its strength in the town until it was liberated on 17th June, in addition to the liberation of Al-Nasira village, 2 kilometers from Al-Dushaysha, and Syria Democratic Forces reached 3 kilometers from the Iraqi borders. The liberation of campaign of Al-Dushaysha started on June 3rd, 2018, from 2 axes. The western axis Al-Shaddadi and the eastern Al-Hol. It succeeded to liberating the entire town and its villages and farms with an area of 600 kilometers, in addition to liberate Tal Sufuk passageway. And the Syrian Democratic Forces met with the Iraqi forces in the border on the 24th of the same of the month. The fighters were able to liberate hundreds of civilians in these villages, while the engineering teams dismantled many of the mines planted by the terrorists to impede the progress of the fighters, and found the tunnels used in the battles. During the battles and the clashes, in which all types of light, medium, and heavy weapons were used in both axes, 274 terrorists, including 4 princes, were killed and 13 another were captured. A bank of vehicle and another truckload of doshka were also destroyed, in addition to 2 others, one of which was booby-trapped and the other loaded with ammunition, and a number of motorbikes, as well as the destruction of 8 headquarters that were armed by the terrorists. Terrorists suffered of heavy losses. 6 mortars and 2 obus gunships were destroyed, 2 trenches used by the terrorists in battle, as well as the seizure of large amounts of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. In this heroic battle, 3 Syrian Democratic Forces fighters were martyred and 20 others wounded. 5th July 2018. The Syrian Democratic Forces announced that its series of military operations against the terror woes initiated by al-Shaddadi and al-Hol in the second phase of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign between the 24th of June and the 5th of July 2018 resulted in the liberation of an area of 33 kilometers, including 31 villages are Tuwamin, Shada, Suwayan, Hawija, Rihaniya, Siraj, Gadir, Abdullah, Al-Madina, Wadi al-Shawk, Jalgam, Khaira, Gariba, Zagrir, Al-Dabja, Jalib Nada, Khaira Sharki, Sgar, Wadi Abu Hamdi, Wadi al-Shaja, Shihaim, Klib Fokani, As-Siha, Abu Fas, Ruwaishid, Kazim, Mushirfa, Klib Tahtani, Abar al-Abad, al-Agrash, and Kalka. In addition to the liberation of dozens of farms and the liberation of hundreds of civilians and dismantling and detonation of many of mines inside. 24th of July 2018. In the middle of the eastern desert of Deir ez-Zor, the Syrian Democratic Forces advanced on 3 axes, heading south along the parallel lines to the Syrian-Iraqi border on the one hand and adjacent to the Khabur River on the other. They were able to liberate 35 kilometers to the south of the Euphrates River, and the distance from the town of Dushaysha until the last point was about 100 kilometers, while securing the Syrian-Iraqi border. On August 4th, in the course of the 3-axis battle, Syrian Democratic Forces made significant progress approximately 37 kilometers to the southeast in the desert region between the town of Dushaysha and the far east from the Euphrates River, during which a number of ISIS terrorist points were destroyed, many terrorists were captured, and 2 oil fields, Al-Azraq and Al-Maleh, used by ISIS to fund his terrorist activities, were liberated too. A year after the launch of Al-Jazeera Storm campaign, on 11th September 2018, Syrian Democratic Forces held a press conference and announced the launch of the final phase of the campaign as the Defeat Terrorism Battle to liberate the remaining areas of Deir ez-Zor countryside east of the Euphrates River from the control of the remnants of ISIS.
لا تزال حملة عاصفة الجزيرة مستمرة إلى هذه اللحظة في آخر معركة لها، معركة دحر الإرهاب لدحر إرهابي داعش بشكل نهائي من الشمال السوري وصولا للحدود العراقية. إن قواتنا أينما تواجد الإرهاب ستتواجد لدحره بشكل نهائي ولتحرير أهلنا وشعبنا وأرضنا من الظلم والعدوان.
And the campaign continues as long as terrorism lies in Syria.